I'm Brad.
I'm Scott.
Welcome to Curiosity.
We have Serafina on the show with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We are going to dive right in. We've got lots of questions to cover on the Curiosity podcast here, Serafina. As you may or may not know, we just want to cover who you are as a human. What was some of the decision-making processes that got you into what you're doing today? Obviously, you've got a lot of external facing things that you're doing as the executive director of Houston Exponential here in town, but certainly interested in some of your thinking and exploring a bit with us how the role of curiosity it gets incorporated into human existence and how we get more of that into our lives. So that's the goal.
Love it. Let's dive right in.
Awesome. All right. Well, Brad asks the big existential questions, and I typically ask sort of like the more, tell me about a time. And I'm always interested. So I'll kick off and then Brad's got his that's coming. So I just want to know, I'm always interested in just a little bit of like the origin story. Like as you think about sort of what you're into today, like was there a moment, a spark or an exposure to something or somebody you saw in action that you sort of lean on or think back to as kind of whether it's an inflection point, it doesn't have to be like overly dramatic, but just something that for you was like, yeah, that pointed me in a direction that got me into what I'm doing today.
I reflect on this a lot, actually. So my path towards where I am today has been a winding one. I started off in undergrad, pre-med, went to med school, realized about 6 months into the program that it was not for me because I kept going back to this question. Why do health disparities even exist to begin with? That's when the role of public health and sociology and really dismantling the health system as a whole became my priority. And that led me to South by Southwest for my 7th year in a row. 6 years prior to that, I actually made the pilgrimage for the music festival because, side note, I used to produce music and moonlighted at a record label, and there's a whole backstory there. But for this year, I decided to go to the Interactive Week. And for the first time, I met these really cool entrepreneurs in the health tech space that asked the same questions that I was asking, that were curious about the same things that I was curious about. And lo and behold, they were from Houston, or their journeys brought them to Houston through a program over at the medical center called TMCX. And I was just, my mind was blown. I grew up in Houston, at least for part of my life, never stubbornly applied to schools on the East Coast because I never saw myself in the state. But all of a sudden, I was meeting these people who were telling me and selling me on my hometown. So that was really my inflection point. I think I extended my flight about 3 times after meeting founder after founder, investor. I actually met someone with his own podcast called the Health Makers Show that I ended up co-producing with him, and decided, after the 3rd time of extending my flight, I was going to call movers back in Boston, and they packed up my apartment, and that was it. That was my journey to Houston. So that led me to a short stint in the health tech community here in Houston that led me to Station Houston, which is one of the first accelerators in town, incubators in town, and meeting people that took a bet on me. And I ended up at a venture design studio, and I ended up at Houston Exponential about 3 years ago. And it was a lot of being led by my passions and my curiosity. So very winding path to answer your question in the shortest way. It was not as predetermined as one may think.
Yeah. You sort of just kind of like threw in there like moonlighting at a record label and like kind of some other things. And so I'm just sort of like, what was there sort of a thread, a music thread alongside this kind of medical thread? Like just kind of what,
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't think of a place where they intersect. I always saw them as very distinct identities of myself that never really overlapped. And I mean, quite literally, one was my day gig and my night gig. I think in in all of these identities of mine, though, there's some aspect of like being a searcher, a digger, a seeker. What I love about music is, being the first to find a really cool beat or a really amazing artist. And that's true in my role at HX as well, right? I'm meeting with founders and I'm trying to understand the problems that they're solving, what ignites them, what resources they need. And a bit of it is also motivated by wanting to be the first person that they call and the first place that they turn to. And so that's why I'm really thrilled to be in the seat that I'm in today, because it allows you to marry a lot of that.
A lot of opportunity for discovery of new things.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of curiosity.
It sure does.
It's kind of the beauty of human existence. Love that. It's really cool. So, maybe thinking about just your journey, which is super exciting, and how you said like many of these aspects don't necessarily like collide with one another, but I would imagine there's like some inspiration or influence where there is like some level of convergence, like something happening in one aspect of moonlighting at a record label to, as you said, at your day job. Like, were there moments or behaviors that you felt like kind of did blend into one another in some capacity?
Yeah. I think in all of these contexts, I am 1 degree away from an artist. I think of founders as creatives, right? You're imagining a world different than the one you currently live in, and you're building towards that vision, and that's similar to the arts. So maybe that's what it is. And I'm also now asking myself, what is that collision? I don't know if I can articulate it, but there's something there.
Yeah. Seems really beautiful to think about. I mean, I've always said, like, where I hear God is in a symphony. There's just something beautiful about just all of these strings and instruments coming together to like produce this beautiful sound, right? And I think about that very similarly in innovation. I think about that in designing and creating and just like traveling the world, like everything that I'm, super grateful and thankful to get to do. I just feel like life is this beautiful symphony that's like so wonderfully interwoven in this really like magical way, like so serendipitous, like things that you could just never, like you said, like your journey, you never could have charted that if you tried. That's just the beauty of life, is it just kind of unfolds over time and happens. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but it'd be interesting to think through that journey and like, yeah, like maybe you don't know fully the answer right now, but maybe that makes you a little more curious as much as it's making me right now on the journey ahead and where those collisions are. That's super cool. I love that. I had no idea that you moonlighted as a producer. That's amazing. Cool.
And just sort of as you're talking through that, Brad, and it's kind of not one individual is able to sort of produce that all, whether that's music or that's a startup or that's a community. It takes a collective. It takes this connectedness.
Yeah.
And there is sort of this shared desire, shared outcome that brings sort of people together. What have you found sort of in these endeavors as you've kind of you kind of in your viewfinder, you get to see sort of all these different creative personalities and individuals, and they're all sort of pursuing something maybe at the surface level that is different, but that they all sort of rely and lean on and require sort of one another to be able to achieve kind of the beauty of the outcome that can only be achieved from kind of all of them coming together. I guess if I were to sort of put that into a question, is like, are there some characteristics around those people that you see come across? Are there people that sort of self-select out of that? And I ask that question to the lens of, we like to think that the audience of the podcast and people that are listening in are on their own kind of curious journey and looking to sort of understand, like, how can I add value to that kind of ecosystem and other things? And so what are some of the characteristics to look out for?
Yeah. I think any organic community, and a thriving organic community, has trust and openness as a central tenet. That's exceptionally true in the music industry. And I find that to be true in the Houston startup ecosystem, right? Opportunities, partnerships, even, you know, at the very like root level of finding a first customer or a pilot or your first investor. It's based on the relationship that is, it's very relationship driven, right? And in order to have a successful relationship, there must be a open and honest channel.
I like it. And that takes a degree of vulnerability.
Absolutely.
I mean, that requires, you know, this idea of bringing your whole self to something and not leaving anything behind requires vulnerability and sort of a willingness to stumble, fall, look stupid, fail, but that all of that is irrelevant in light of sort of the desired outcome. And so to have that driving and motivating factor.
You know, it's interesting. It reminds me of creative confidence as a construct. I was speaking with someone earlier, I guess not this week because it's early in the week, but late last week. We were talking about the role that confidence plays in our decision-making process in our daily lives and how just like fundamentally critical it is to our own humanity and identity. And I started thinking about like your own creative confidence and maybe like curiosity confidence. I don't know if that combination of words goes well together or not, but in thinking through that.
I like it.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to go with it then. I lacked confidence in that moment.
I'm here for you, Brad.
Curious, confidently curious. I'm going to keep working on it. Next show, we'll be better at that, what I think. But that ideal and that ambition, right? And so it's kind of a two-part question. The first one is like, with all the things that inspire you, why do you get out of bed every day?
It's a really good question. I've been reflecting on this a lot recently as well. And it's also in light of, you know, this exercise that we did as an organization not too long ago, asking ourselves, what is our reason for existence and where do we see ourselves in 10, 20 years? And what is it that we'd like to see in the world? And part of my, you know, my personal, like reason for existence and reason for doing what I do today has a lot to do with this opportunity that I see in Houston, which is some may call as a last mover advantage in developing a strong tech economy. We really do have the chance to create the most inclusive ecosystem we possibly can in the way that our analog ecosystems like the Bay Area, New York City, have not been able to do successfully. And Houston as being one of the most diverse cities in the United States, and
currently the most diverse again this year.
Yeah, that's also a very complex term, right? We might be the most diverse, but look at the geography of Houston and the spread and the clusters of ethnicities and socioeconomic class. It's not, you know, in a textbook definition of diversity, you would see equal representation or some semblance of representation across all those dimensions wherever you go. That's not necessarily the case in Houston. And I don't want that necessarily to be the case for our ecosystem either. So how do we leverage that diversity to be a core strength of Houston's ecosystem? How do we create more on-ramps for Black and Brown communities to our ecosystem? And thinking through what that future could look like and how beautiful it would be, that gets me up in the morning every day.
That's a wonderful reason to get up every day. I love that. So the role that inclusivity could play in tech and innovation and all of these various industries, and obviously far beyond that. Being inclusive of all things. I think
that
that's
outcome
beautiful.
Requires a champion. It's not going to happen on its own. Like people need to stand up and advocate for it.
Yeah. I mean, even just like the work we're doing with the digital divide and how critical it is to close that massive chasm. It takes, and to accelerate it. That's the other aspect. It's not just closing it, it seems like, or bringing more inclusivity. It's accelerating how we bring inclusivity to our community. Because I think that's one of the coolest things about Houston. Obviously, there's a lot of things I love about Houston, but the fact that we are so diverse leads us to opportunities to be very inclusive. It's a journey for sure. And I don't think we're perfect at it by any means, but I think we're making some strides, which is pretty exciting. That's cool. And which leads me to kind of the second aspect. I think that like maybe diving in a little bit more to the role that confidence does play, because this is an interesting point, and I'm totally stream of consciousing right now. But from this conversation that I had, I'm not one who's lacked a lot of confidence in my life. And so typically if I've had like a ridiculous idea, I've just kind of gone and done it without much concern for what anyone else thought or didn't think. I was just doing it because I believed in it, and I'm very convicted by my passions. But talking with someone who didn't feel that way, and maybe there's people listening to the podcast who, like, yeah, I love the ideals of curiosity and I want to be more curious, but like there's a lot of existential questions that can come from that as well. And it does leave you very vulnerable. And I'd also, for the confidence that I do have, I'd be lying if I said, like, there haven't been moments where I felt the hurt and the pain, because I'm also very affected by what people say. Like, words mean a lot to me. It's one of my top love languages. And so, like, from your perspective, like confidence as a construct for curiosity, if you almost think about the role that the world's longest question, but I'm getting there. If you almost think about the role that curiosity has played in your daily life, but equal to that, the confidence that it's required in order to take action and advance those ambitions. Like, what does that look like for you?
Thank you so much for asking this question. I think it's really important to highlight that the other side of the coin of confidence is also psychological safety and safety nets. And if you put yourself in the shoes of someone that never had that growing up, imagine how much differently they operate in terms of, just going after an idea because, you're gung-ho and you believe that it's the right thing to do, not having the psychological safety to go after it because you can't, the risks are too high. The risks outweigh the benefits. I think a lot of it has to do with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you don't have levels 1 and level 2, how can you excel towards like that self-actualization? That is, that only becomes feasible through through engendering curiosity in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is so true. I mean, the thing I think of immediately is education, especially K through 12, but even more fundamentally 0 to 5 education. I think we mentioned on the podcast last time, we talked about this a little bit, but there's a really cool organization here in Houston called Collaborative for Children. I'm sure there's many of them, but Collaborative's entire focus is all on 0 to 5 education, because in the public school system, that doesn't really get a lot of attention. It fundamentally gets zero attention. And education is core to our ability to survive and thrive, and talk about basic needs. Like, what is the journey that, or I guess like from where you sit and the type, I mean, obviously you're working with founders and startups that typically are probably at least through the K through 12 system, or, I mean, maybe there's a young founder out there, and I hope there are, and hope there's more of them, but more often than not, the data shows that most founders are going to be post K through 12 grade school. Right. But with that said, like from almost that lens and perspective and what you're seeing within education, like what do you feel like are the main behaviors or skills that we need to see more in that 0 to 5 or that K through 12 education to prepare young humans with some of those basic needs and, build maybe some of those like unorthodox, untraditional skills that aren't currently being taught, but could be and would help?
Critical thinking, though, I'm not sure how it's how it can be how you can expose someone at such an early age to that, but I'm sure there are ways. I'm not an expert, but I'm sure there are people that are studying this. I think critical thinking was actually one of the central tenets to some of my earlier education in a program, a magnet program called International Baccalaureate, where you're encouraged to ask questions and to have a discourse and learn through discussion. It's discussion-based learning, a lot of it, even in the sciences, which is really interesting. Allows you to understand things from different perspectives and defend your ideas, and also be open to those ideas being offended, which I think is an important life skill that in the standard K through 12, at least in the United States, I don't see as a fundamental value. There's also other ways to instill confidence, and it happens outside of the educational setting, and it happens in your socialization, your nurturing, your milieu. And perhaps this is something that, we're being more awakened to as a society. But I wish like it were distilled to tactics or strategies that, you can pass along through generations. But I mean, Scott, you've got little people in your life. How are you doing this?
I think one of the things, there's I think a lot of challenges on sort of this whole mosaic of how our brains form and how kind of that education experience and that sort of school environment, home environment sort of establishes that foundation, and why that 0 to 5 is such an important component of that. And something that we certainly touch on kind of through various kind of episodes of the podcast. But I think this idea of this encouraging question asking, and I think it's this difficulty of sort of in the face of, we'll call it broadly authority, whether that's a teacher or a parent or whatever it might be. If we're not careful, we establish these rules and boundary conditions, many of which are initially rooted in establishing safety, because 0 to 5 education doesn't matter if you can't get your kid out of, age 2 to 5, you got to get them. Yeah. You got to keep them alive. That's really important. So safety becomes sort of priority. And so you start to establish these do's and don'ts, yeses and nos. And there's not a lot of conversation about what those are, because in many cases, a small child isn't going to understand what that boundary condition is. And I could argue that we start to forget that that's why we're establishing this sort of authoritarian kind of construct. And then it becomes, sort of lives on. And so some of the things that I like to think about having a 13-year-old and 11-year-old, in addition to a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, I won't forget about them, but they're still kind of coming along, is a recognition that even by the time that they're 10 years old, 13 years old, they've actually learned a bunch of stuff or read books that I haven't read, or know things that I don't know, or are into things that I haven't appreciated before. Mm-hmm. And so I'll say that one of the things is, as a parent, to be curious, like, what is it? Like, we could take a step deeper into, any kind of existence before you come into this world and what that looks like. But they come into this world with their own personalities, their own like interests and their own. And so seeing that spark and that, and cultivating that and helping facilitate that is where I've had my better parental moments. Mm-hmm. And another thing, in addition to having 4 kids, I'm the oldest of 8 kids. And so
Whoa.
my, and this isn't about me, but I say that there's a lot of behaviors that I had in like helping to raise 7 younger siblings versus how I think about my 4. And I think there's a lot of pivots that need to be made there. But I think part of that is that it's a recognition. I'll say it this way, because I've heard it, is if you can only learn from people that are smarter than you, then you will have a very limited life experience. And that's something that I think we can lose track of, is that if we've gotten to a certain point in our career or in our lives, or a certain expertise, that the other humans that we come into contact with, regardless of age, don't have anything to offer. And so frankly, that's one of the driving forces for me, and the curiosity journey, is that I have found life to be, and relationships to be, that much more robust and enriching when you're asking questions and other things. And so encouraging that of others, and that establishes that psychological safety that then can build on other things that we could dig into. But since you asked the question, that's I think part of it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. I love what you shared on, if you're only exposed to those that are smarter than you, you're like, your experience will be really limited. I have a similar, mantra that I live by. And that's, act as if, and believe, I believe this, that everyone around me, everyone I interact with is sitting on the world's most interesting story, experience. And it's my job to learn that from them. So
I like that.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of where that's
right?
That's just one that jumps to mind, or one that is sort of stands out as like maybe one of the most unexpected kind of discoveries in that?
Well, just what happened right now is one of those examples. I love learning from my 4-year-old niece. I love to ask her about her days and why she does the things she does, and just experiencing her experience the world is the most enlightening thing to me. And, you as a parent and learning from your purview and your experiences are also like, they're opening my eyes to a lot more about you. So, yeah.
All right. I made it onto the list.
You are on the list.
You're on the list with my 4-year-old, like Coco, my niece. So that's a great place to be.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, you've made it. So we could just end the show right now.
It's a good day. Yeah, yeah.
Just say that's it,
and that's a wrap.
That's beautiful. So going back, maybe way back, like let's talk about a 4-year-old niece and the insatiable curiosity that we have, especially from 0 to 5. I mean, kind of keeping within the educational aspect. You touched a little bit on your own lived experiences in the role that education played and the type of education program that you grew up in, which is really interesting. And so it'd be really cool to maybe dig deep into the memories of those moments. And what are some of the like super cool moments that you feel like shaped some of your life experiences and the navigational serendipitous path that you were talking about earlier on in the show that has led you to just have some of the just like traits and personality that you feel like are super core to your identity and your humanity today?
Well, obviously my story began with my parents' journey. So they were both immigrants in the 70s and 80s from Afghanistan and Cuba, and made their way through South Africa. Also a winding journey, right? Lived through apartheid in South Africa, came to America and gave birth to me. Were semi-successful, sometimes unsuccessful entrepreneurs. And that's kind of where that's kind of when I decided that entrepreneurship was not for me. I would go a more traditional route, and I would study pre-med, and I would go to med school, and that was the journey, and that was the pathway that I defined for myself. But almost at every turn, I kept being pivoted back towards build a creative career or entrepreneurship, and now I'm in a space where both of those worlds are colliding. And I saw my own parents' lived experiences, how much they struggled, and how trying those times were, and that is also an inherent motivator for me. I don't want anyone else to experience that, especially someone that looks like me or, comes from a similar background. I want the next generation to have a much better experience, especially in this new knowledge economy where there's so many resources available to you. So my goal, and back to the reason why I get up every morning, to surround, people with the resources that they need to survive and thrive.
Oh, that's beautiful. What's like some advice you would give to, humans that have maybe shared a similar path that you've shared that might be in a different place right now? And maybe they're just getting a little curious and starting to think about how they pivot and make a different path and build the life they love, so to speak.
Yeah. Be bold. Just go after it. Like the worst case scenario is not as bad as you think it is. If there's something that is keeping you up at night, there's no reason as to why you shouldn't take the risk. Yeah.
There's some lyric knocking around in my head. I don't know where it's from. I heard it whenever we're driving in the car. Something about having 13 and 11-year-old is that you lose complete control of the radio. That's also something. But it's that.
Do you still listen to a radio?
For sure, in the car. Yeah.
So it's not like iTunes or like Spotify.
No,
it's like straight up
old school radio. Yeah,
whatever.
The kids are like totally into it. It's
all
like
the FM games.
It's like retro. Wow. I don't know.
That is retro. That's amazing.
Is it that
I love it.
Your dreams won't chase you. You have to chase your dreams.
Ooh.
And that like it's you.
Sounds like a really good rap lyric.
Yeah, it was probably country.
Okay, also great. I mean, these days they're blending, so
it could do anything.
True.
But who knows? It's constantly toggling. But that one's as you were talking, Serafina, that was kind of rattling around. Is that like it requires effort, and it's that activation energy, and I think that's something that for those that have fallen in love with the startup community like you have and sort of have that experience, you've that's now been reinforced in you, is that like the activation energy versus the payoff is worth it every time.
Yeah.
My timer went off.
Got it. I'm just like still sitting here thinking about your parents' journey, and I am like really like, whoa.
It's like a part 2 that we
incredible.
Need to do.
Like, when are mom and dad coming on? Because we need to really dive into this.
Yeah.
Like, I am like,
So
I mean,
cool.
if I have a follow-on question, I guess it does come more from, your life experiences and the amazing journey it sounds like they went on to get you to the place where you are today, which is incredible and honorable and amazing, and probably more than my words will speak in this moment. And we talked about like be bold, which I think is super cool, but kind of like that whole idea of like creative confidence. I mean, if we dig in a little more to like the how, like, I mean, and pick any example from like the schools you chose to go to, the reasons you pivoted from one discipline to another, even how you got into producing music. Like, pick any story that you're most excited about. But like, how does someone make that leap? Okay, yes, I'm feeling bold, I'm feeling motivated, but like, okay, what's next? Like, where do I go from this internal emotion that I'm feeling and like bring that to life?
Yeah. So the other day when you and I caught up, I was reflecting on this term that Diversity Fund Houston coined, and I love it, and I will continue to utilize it. It's called inspiration capital. The experience of having someone a few steps ahead of you in your, in the journey that you're aspiring to. People have been my like, if I were to attribute any of my success, whatever that means, to any single to any single thing, it's comes down to people. People helping to guide you on your path, people taking a risk on you, people being a mentor to you, sharing their journey, sharing their hardships, so you don't have to go through that again, like in the way that they did. I think, if you know what your next step may look like, find someone who's a couple steps ahead of you and just reach out. Chances are I'd be hard pressed to think that like someone who you reach out to that you admire, that you aspire to be, wouldn't want to help you in your own personal journey.
That's a great point. I think humans are more accessible than we think they are. Like, I think a lot of times we put these orthodoxies up in our own minds and these barriers that say undoubtedly like, that person's out of reach or out of touch. But I'd agree. I've reached out to a lot of humans over the years, just even through like LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I've almost always gotten a response back, especially when it was like, hey, I want to like get more involved in this, or I'm super curious about what you're up to, whatever it might be. Just like those really like authentic asks, I think, tend to be known. There's also a lot of asks on platforms like LinkedIn that are not authentic. Yeah, they're just trying to sell you something.
Yeah.
How many of those do we get a day?
So be real and reach out, and chances are they'll surprise you with their response.
Yeah, and their willingness to like roll up their sleeves and help as well. Okay, I love that. It's amazing.
It's awesome. Serafina, it has been a real privilege to have you on the show. Appreciate all of your time. And where can the listeners find you if they wanted to connect?
I suppose you can find me on LinkedIn. So I'm Serafina Lalany, soon to be De La Fuente.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And Serafina at HoustonExponential.org. I'm always happy to hear from people, especially aspiring entrepreneurs.
Very cool.
Love that.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for being on the show with us. Onward.